welcome to Journeys of Faith. This week we have Rhiannon with us from, well, I came across you on TikTok, and just wondering, Rhiannon, if you would like to just explain a bit about yourself to the listeners.
Yeah, I'm Rhiannon Grant. I'm a Quaker, although I'm also connected to some other faith traditions like Druidry and Buddhism. I do quite a lot on TikTok. I talk about Quakers on TikTok, and a big Quaker meeting recently wrote in their minutes that I was a legendary TikToker. That was the words of the 11 to 15-year-old group. So I was happy with that. But I also teach about Quakerism in different contexts, mainly with Woodbrook, the Quaker educational charity, and particularly in the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies, where I support postgraduate research students looking at all sorts of things to do with Quakers.
Right, amazing. So I'm going to ask the question that everyone else is probably asking: what is a Quaker?
What is a Quaker? A Quaker is a person who belongs to the Quaker community. The Quaker community is a faith group who are interested in connecting with God or the divine or the light or the spirit, however we understand that, but connecting with it directly and developing our own understandings. So a lot of the Quaker community in what we call the liberal or unprogrammed tradition uses lots of silence as a key technique to do that.
Silence. Now I struggle with silence. I've got a thing even when I'm on my own, I really struggle with silence. So the Quaker traditions, or where did Quakers originate from? How did it come about? Just so I could get a better understanding of what a Quaker is fully as well.
Yeah, so if we think about all of Christian history, we have kind of this moment roughly in the middle where we get the Reformation and we get lots and lots of small Protestant groups bubbling up. And we could put the Quakers as part of that kind of moment of changes that happened over several hundred years, actually. And so Quakers start in England. We often date the start to 1652 because it's useful to have a particular year, although of course a big movement of people doesn't come together around a single moment. But George Fox, who was a key early leader in the Quaker movement, had a vision in 1652 of there being a great people to be gathered. And so when he tells that story later on, people kind of identify that as a starting point. And he was interested in really rejecting quite a lot of what people were trying to do with the church at that time. He thought that it wasn't necessary to have a particular education. You didn't have to be trained at one of the universities. You could read the Bible. They were in a moment where they'd got the Bible in English for the first time. Fox read it himself. He's said to have memorized almost all of it, so that if the Bible was lost, it could be reconstructed from Fox's memory. And of course, the same is true of lots of other people who engage very deeply with their Bibles. So he was reading the Bible for himself, and he was finding that God was telling him directly things that didn't necessarily fit with the rest of what was going on in the world at that time. So in England at that point, we're having the Commonwealth. So there's quite a lot of civil war. There's quite a lot of violence. There's quite a lot of heightened tension around religious issues. So people are very, very engaged with their spiritual lives and what happens in the next life and what's the right way to worship. Those questions are really burning questions in all of society. And Quakers are speaking into that space and making a contribution to trying to answer those questions.
Okay, that sounds really interesting, because obviously I come from originally a Church of England background, was baptized, then converted when I sort of in 2007 to Roman Catholicism, and then came back to the Church of England when I moved back to Manchester. And obviously, like you've just said, in that time of, the very first sort of scriptures, there's been several little schisms, and each schism has caused a little breakaway. So it's really interesting how I'm really fascinated how when something causes what will have been perceived as the main faith at that time for that particular group of people, how they break away and then they start their own, pardon the way I word these, offsets of their faith, and how they take and take this bit that's really good for them, and then they take that bit and throw it away because actually that doesn't really work, if that makes sense. So I think the church that stands today, that needs to be more open to and willing to change these little things. So you mentioned worship a little bit, so correct me if I'm wrong, and please do. Is I understand that your worship is not led by anyone in particular. It's more a lot of silence, and when someone feels that they're being pushed to talk, and I say that because I don't want to say that they feel God's asking them to speak, or that they feel some people find that really difficult. I was listening to one of your TikToks before that was talking about our true in-depth, our personal experiences with God, and I do believe at times God does whisper in my ear and say, you need to kick yourself up the backside and move. So I believe in that bit. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, so there are different ways of describing this. You said not led by anyone in particular, and I think a traditional Quaker view would be that it is led by God.
yeah,
But it doesn't have a human leader.
yeah,
We appoint some people in the community to look after some of the practical stuff around the community and to pay attention to whether the worship is working well. But yeah, the point about unprogrammed worship is that it doesn't have a program, it doesn't have a plan in advance. So usually we set a beginning time and we might have an idea about the end time, because it's useful to have those practical things, but we don't know what's going to happen in the middle. So we start with silence, we wait, we listen to ourselves and each other and God, the spirit, the light, however we understand that. And yeah, when people feel moved to speak, they might do that. In some contexts, they might do something other than speak. So I've heard people give ministry by singing. Some people might have a ministry of expressive movement or something like that. And in welcoming worship or an all age worship, people might also express themselves through drawing or something like that. But yeah, the point is that you haven't decided in advance. So the early Quakers would have said, we're not going to say prayers that are somebody else's words. We're only going to pray it if we really feel it. We're not going to sing a psalm that's the one that's picked out in the list. We'll pick a psalm and sing it when we feel led to that.
yeah.
We'll say what comes to us, what's fresh and real in the moment. And you can see that as part of a broader commitment to really telling the truth all the time and not being bound by what seems like a good idea or making a pattern or something else that might be imposed by a human practice, but really trying to do what God wants us to do in that moment.
No, that sounds really good, because I'm a lover of sometimes just, I'll pick my Bible up and I'll sit there and I do like to try and have quiet. I really do struggle with quiet. I'm that person who at quiet times my mind runs away with me, and I'm just thinking. But I do try to have that time, and I do. I more flick through the Bible without looking. So I'll just flick, stop on a page, hover the finger, and bang. And 9 times out of 10, the verse that seems to say something to me about how I'm feeling at that moment in time. So it sounds like a tradition that is allowing people to explore their time with God, being led by God rather than being told what. I really like that bit of, actually, we're not going to read that, we're not going to do this, we're not going to sing that song, we're not going to do that. We're literally going to sit here and we're going to go with what we feel is what's meant to be said. Now, I've lost myself in my thought then, sorry. I was just thinking of something and I've totally lost where I was. So if I remember, I'll come back to it.
Could I pick up on something you said then?
Feel free to.
Yeah, which is, and I think I relate to that experience of finding silence very difficult. I think that's true for a lot of us. Maybe it's more true in the modern world where we have more options to have sound on. But actually, in any community, you can have constant busyness. There are tasks to do. There are chores to think about. There's always something going on. Even if you cut out some of the technology and things, there's this kind of constant flow of just keeping life going.
Yeah.
And it is really difficult to get out of that. But one of the things that I find, and this is a bit of a paradox, I think there's a Zen saying that says something like, if you can't sit for 1 hour, you should sit for 3 hours. And there is something about, if you just let it happen and you sit for longer, actually that's when things start to shift. So certainly my experience is that if I sit in for 10 minutes of quiet time or 15 minutes of quiet time, I might not finish going through all those things that are in my mind. And I can be bringing them into the light. I can be upholding situations that are worrying me. I can be praying about them or kind of thinking them through with God, trying to take a broader perspective on things. But actually, by the time I get to the end of an hour, I sometimes have finished all of those things.
Yeah.
And some Quakers have an extended meeting for worship where there might be 3 or even 4 hours of worship. Which actually, it shifts the expectations a bit. People don't expect you to sit in the same chair for 4 hours without ever leaving the room. So people come and go slightly more, and they go out to use the toilet or get a drink of water or whatever they need. So it's a bit easier physically, but also after 4 hours, you actually have finished going through all of those things, and there's nothing more to think about. And you can go sometimes to a deeper place. And it's really challenging. And there are people who have really big challenges with silence, people for whom it can remind them of traumatic incidents, people who find it really difficult. It can be really difficult to sit still physically. It can be a mental health problem in different ways. But for those of us who find it possible to use it in that kind of way, staying with it can be really powerful. So yeah, I'd encourage people to experiment if they feel able to do that, because it is, your experience in the first 10 minutes isn't necessarily what apparently the same 10 minutes of silence feels like at the end of an hour.
Oh, no, I can relate to that, because part of my story is I went to Lord's in 2008. And during that process, I went down to the niche where Mary, and I say supposedly because I don't want anyone to go, oh, well, yeah, and I don't want that, because it's all down to each individual, where she appeared to Bernadette. And I literally sat in the grotto, and it was the first, without knowing it, I thought it was 10 minutes, and it was actually 3 hours. And it was just me there, because it was at night, and when I went back to the hotel, people was like, we was just about to get worried about you because where was you? You know, we was a bit, and I literally just sat there and just kneeled and just in my head got all this stuff out, and that's when I really got a passion and a self, I want to say self-awareness of what I felt God was calling me to be, which is to become a vicar within the Church of England, which is something I'm still exploring, but in a slightly different way because I've been hurt by the institution. And I think
Yeah.
when we have leaders, and I think that's, I've not done much research on Quakers, but from my very small research, not having real like powerful leaders as such, where they're really in your face people who are recognized by everyone, I think that makes it easier because you're all sort of meeting, and get me and correct me if I'm wrong, you all meet on the same level. So there's not, oh, I'm a bishop or I'm this or I'm that, and people are expecting this, looking up to this person. And I'm going to say pedestal because I think we do put some of our leaders on pedestals, and sometimes I don't think it's good to put people on pedestals because sometimes people do fall off them, and it's harder to put them back when they've fell off for whatever reason, or if you've suddenly found out something about them, it's harder to put them back up on the pedestal. So I do like that idea of, and I think one of your TikToks, I because I'm looking at some of your TikToks in random fashion because TikTok does that, which is quite. That's the only thing I don't like. I wish it would show everything in order that they was done. You was actually talking about Freemasons and Quakers because someone had obviously asked you that question, and I was like, "Ooh, that's actually an interesting way of looking at it," because obviously Freemasons meet, what we say is, because I am a Freemason, we all meet on a level, so it doesn't matter what your job might be outside of Freemasonry, but when we come together in Freemasonry, there is no, you are my boss or you are my officer in the army, or there's none of that. We are all brothers on the same level, and that's how I like to have my faith, is we are all brothers and sisters in Christ, or whoever your I'm trying to find the right word, the brain's done it again, whoever you worship, we are all on the same level. It doesn't matter what faith we're from, we are all brothers and sisters in Christ, and we should all look at each other that we are the same. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what color we are, whether we're man, woman, a businessman or not, we are all the same on the inside. We all have the same feelings. We just deal with them differently and cope with them in a different way. And I'm just trying to think of the question I was trying to say. So do you find that Quakers embrace that, or is there still some, not reluctance, but conflicts within? Because I'm sure, just like any faith, there is people who think it should be done this way and not that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So conflict is part of any community,
Yeah.
right? It's a normal part of life. And yeah, so absolutely, we have this theory that everyone is equal. So everyone in the community is equal, but actually everyone in the whole world is equal.
Yeah.
And so Quakers do things like not using titles. I'm on a church leaders group, and so it's me and like this bishop and that bishop, and they're all
Yeah.
introducing themselves by their titles, and I'm like, oh, hello, yes, this is Bernard, this is Sarah.
Yeah.
And also I don't use my professional title. In a university context, some people would call me doctor because I've got a doctorate, but in
Right.
public life I wouldn't use that as a title. So we have this theory about everybody being equal, but it's really hard to put that into practice. And so I guess we have two kind of things that go against that, or where we're trying to share the power and the authority round. So we have a formal structure of appointing people to roles, partly because sometimes you need to name someone and say, please,
Yeah.
will you make sure that this gets done, in order for actually the meeting house to be cleaned and the tea to be made and the Zoom
Yeah.
room to be opened and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
You have to ask someone to do it. And we usually try and share those round as far as possible. We try and appoint people to those roles for a limited period of time. So you might take on a pastoral care role, or a leadership role, or a practical organizational role, or being treasurer, but you would only do that for maybe 3 years or 6 years. And then we would expect that to be passed on to somebody else.
Yeah.
And so there's an idea there about people having responsibility, authority, power for a period of time, but then moving it on to somebody else, so that you don't ask everyone in the community to be treasurer all at the same time, because the bookkeeping would be much too confusing.
Yeah.
But equally, you don't pick one person and say you're the treasurer for the rest of your life,
Yeah.
because you need to share it round to make sure that more people are involved.
Yeah.
But while people are in those roles, obviously, it can be a challenge to get the right balance between delegating something to somebody, giving them the authority that they need in order to carry out the responsibility that we've asked them to carry out, and that being a location of power in the community. And you can get a committee or a group who actually are making most of the decisions for the community, and it
Yeah.
can get unbalanced. And of course, you get personality clashes, and people who make mistakes, and
Yeah.
people who just have a very blunt way of talking, which actually is often welcomed among Quakers who really like to tell the truth. But those sorts of things, you can always get
Yeah.
interpersonal conflicts, and some situations are genuinely very morally complex, so you can get conflict about that as well. And then, kind of alongside that, there can be we have to recognize the informal stuff that happens. So obviously, social status stuff from outside the Quaker community. We have this theory that everybody is equal,
Yeah.
but if you're a white person, you have more social power than a person of color. If you're a straight person, you might have more
Yeah.
social power, and if you're a man, and so on.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things can, particularly where they're working unconsciously, or they work in a kind of structural way that runs across the whole society we live in, and not just the Quaker community, those can be around in the Quaker community and really quite hard. We try very hard to get rid of them, but it can be very difficult to do that. And there is something, what we sometimes call a weighty friend, or a seasoned friend, a kind of idea that some people get more experience. They get a depth of spiritual insight. They've tried, if you've been in 6 different roles over the course of your life as a Quaker,
Yeah.
you've got an insight into how things work all the way around the community, that maybe someone who's the same age but has only joined the Quaker community recently
Yeah.
might not have that insight. And you can develop community connections if the person who's just newly arrived in a powerful role or in a place of authority is someone that you've been friends with for a long
Yeah.
time. You are in a different relationship to them, even if they're trying to operate in that role and not let those personal things affect them. So some of that informal stuff comes into the Quaker community, and despite our best efforts, it disrupts that attempt to be absolutely equal. I don't know. I imagine that something similar might happen with a group of Freemasons, that those
Yeah.
you can say, well,
Yeah.
in here, you're not my boss and I'm not your
Yeah.
employee, but actually, people are
No,
aware of those kinds of differences.
it does happen. I think it happens in all walks of life as well. It's,
Yeah.
I've had volunteer roles where I've had people who've actually been my manager at work, but then when they come and do their volunteering, I'm actually their lead, I'm their duty officer, and sometimes they find that really difficult because they're used to being the one, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way or anything like that. I'm usually their underling, and I'm usually their one that would be told to do something, whereas it's suddenly role reversal, and I'm the one going, well, you need to do this because
Yeah.
it needs to be done. And sometimes I've gone back to work and they've gone, you picked on me because of, no, I picked on you because you was the person most relevant for that role. And and I don't think there's anywhere in life that is the case. Very similar experiences within the churches I've been part of. I go to some churches and I am the youngest person there, and I'm 42, and I'm by lots of years. And you'll say to someone, have you ever thought of doing this? And they just give you that look of, who are you? You've been here 5 minutes and you're telling us that this might work. And I go, from personal experience, because I'm also dyslexic, so reading isn't my best thing, and they'll give you this book that's like, and you're like, I can't read that. I'm really sorry. We need to look at, or you'll suggest, before Zoom became a big thing for worship, I was one of them people who was going, we should be online. We should be doing some of this online. And then COVID came along, and all these people who were saying, oh, no, we couldn't do that, was suddenly like, well, we need to do something. And then we did it. And then they're like, oh, we should have done this. And then you go, well, I did say that. And they just look at you and give you that. No, I don't remember you saying that. And you could just go, okay, that's fine. I'll take it on the chin. But I think that's anything when there's any form of organization, and in every organization there has to be, like you say, there has to be people responsible for X and Y, because if X and Y doesn't get done, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
So I did. So if I'm just thinking, so if I was to come to a Quaker meeting, is it something that only happens on a Sunday, or is it happen any time of the week, or what would, if I was to turn up at do you call it a meeting house, if I remember rightly?
Yeah.
What would I expect, or what would I see, just as to give people a bit more insight to what it would be like?
Yeah, well, it's going to depend a bit where you turn up.
Yeah.
So, meeting for worship happens now quite a lot on Zoom as well as in person. Exactly that shift you were just describing. Woodbrook, we run meeting for worship on Zoom nearly every day of the week, and sometimes twice. So you can look those times up on our website, and you just press the button and come into the room at any time you want to, really, whenever those meetings for worship are being held. And if you go to a meeting house, so some meetings might be renting a space, or they might be meeting in somebody's private house. But quite a lot of places, there's a purpose-built or an adapted building that's owned by the Quaker community, and we call that a meeting house. So if you turn up at my local meeting house, I go to Bourneville Meeting in Birmingham. It's a purpose-built building. It being Bourneville, you won't be surprised to hear it was funded by the Cadburys. You come in either the front door or the side door. You come into the main hall for worship. Usually, it's quite a big room. It's built perhaps with some church architecture in mind. So Bourneville's meeting hall it's a big room. It's got high windows that start relatively high up. So when you're sitting there, you're not looking, people can't come along and stare in at you. But the windows go quite high up, so you get lots of natural light in. There's a big curved ceiling. But what there isn't is a lot of decoration. So at Bourneville, the The wall that faces you as you come in through the main doors is plain white. It does have an arch of lettering on, which says, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth, which you'll recognize as a biblical quotation. That's actually quite a lot of decoration for a Quaker meeting house.
Right.
And very often it would just be a plain white or cream wall. Often these quite large windows, people have gone for that, where they build a purpose-built building. More recent Quaker meeting houses are often built or adapted with sustainability in mind. So you might see a grass roof or solar panels on the roof, something like that. And within the room, usually chairs arranged in a circle. Historically, they might have been in a kind of square, and people who spoke regularly might have been up slightly higher just because that improves the acoustics. But most meeting houses now are equipped with a microphone and a loop system, so that people are able to hear properly, and everyone can sit in a circle. They might come forward to speak into a mic, especially if the meeting is blended, so that some people are on Zoom. That gives you a better sound quality for the people who are joining online. But people are sitting in a circle trying to model that real equity of position that we were just talking about. And at the beginning, as you come in, usually somebody greets you. So if you come into a Zoom room, there might be a host. If they haven't seen you before, they might send you a private message, or they might give a verbal introduction online that says, welcome to Meeting for Worship. This is what happens. If you have a problem, I'm the person you can contact. If you arrive in person, often that happens just outside the main meeting room. Somebody shakes your hand, waves at you. They might give you a leaflet if you want one. They might just let you into the meeting room. And then in the meeting room, people sit round in silence. Some of them might read something as part of settling down. Some of them might look round to see who all the people are in the room. Some of them will close their eyes. Some of them will focus on their breathing, something like that, and try and settle into the silence and see what happens.
Sounds, it actually sounds really peaceful. It really does. And now, like, I do like I say, I struggle with silence, but I think that's because when you're somewhere that's silent, I tend to hear myself breathe more. And you hear, when everyone's quiet, you can hear all the creaks, and I just get really thinking like, but I just think it does sound really peaceful, and I think I like that back to basic. I think that's what I'm getting from the conversation. It's very, I'm going to say back to nature, because in a sense that's what you're doing, isn't it? You're stripping away the music while you're going in. You're stripping away the expectation of having to sing. You're actually taking someone who actually might feel really uncomfortable in the unfamiliarity of a worship, where they're actually going into something that there's nothing to expect as such. You are taking your inner self in, and I think sometimes that silence allows your inner self to project outwards, because it gives you that time to think. And I think that's why I don't like silence, because I do think about, what did I do? Did I do that right? Should I have done this? Should I have, I'm very critical of myself. I'm just looking here, and
yes, I think a lot of us are very critical of ourselves, and people who have small children or something and bring them into worship, people who need to move often get really, really anxious. But the Quaker view is that that's all part of the ministry. That actually, if you have a cough or your baby cries, or you need to stand up and stretch or lie down on the floor. I know at least one person who, for medical reasons, needs to
Yeah.
lie down for quite a lot of the time. And actually, a Quaker meeting can adapt if people know
Yeah.
that it's normal for you. Nobody's worried about it, and
Yeah.
that's part of the worship too, because we don't have to have expectations on ourselves
Yeah.
about sitting perfectly still for an hour or the chair's not creaking. Actually, that's all part of the richness of the world, and we can
Yeah.
enjoy it if that's the attitude we choose to take.
And I'm correct me if I'm wrong. Did I see something on TikTok where was you talking about? Oh, I don't think it is you. Correct me. Uh, Druid, was that yourself? I seen something about Druid.
Yes,
And
I'm a member of the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, and I do talk about
okay,
Druidry not very often on TikTok, but
no,
sometimes.
no, no. I just find it fascinating how within the church I belong to, there is expectations that you are within that church.
Mhm.
So, you know, when I converted back to Church of England, which I don't think anyone should have to convert. It shouldn't matter. You should be able to go to any church and receive. If you have some form of communion, you should be able to go and you should be able to receive it, because it's. I genuinely believe for communion, you are not communing with the person who's giving you communion. You are actually personally engaging with God in that moment, and you are accepting his gifts that are on offer to you. So I don't think that, I have been denied communion because I was a Catholic, and I've also been denied communion because was in Church of England, and they was like, well, you can't. And I like, I really hate this rigidness of, well, actually, we worship the same God. The only difference in them two faiths that I am part of is one, we have the Queen, or now King. Sorry for that slip up, but I'm so used to saying Queen. But yeah, we have the King as a focal point, and in one we have the Bishop of Rome or the Pope or whatever you want to call it. And I think for me, when you I really do think that's a barrier. Even though I'm saying I want to become a vicar and feel called to become a vicar, I think I'm part of my calling is because I don't see that wall. It's if you worship God of whatever faith, if you come to my church and you wish to receive communion, it's my duty to provide you with that communion, because that communion might be your only link with God if you come from that sort of background. Because obviously, I come from a communion based background. For me, communion is very important. Like, I've not had communion for nearly 2 years now because I won't go to my local churches because of conflicts and disagreements. And I'm very old fashioned and believe that if you've not been to communion, you need to go to confess. But that's because of the way I've been brought up.
Mm.
But I don't believe in that I need to confess to a vicar. I, I believe that if we was having a one-to-one conversation now, I should be able to say to you, Rhiannon, my heart is hurting because of X, Y, and Z. And not for you to forgive me, because it's not your place to forgive, and it's not my place. We can forgive people for doing things to us, but it's not our place to provide the final forgiveness. And that's for God to do. But by me telling you, God sees that as a confession, because I'm telling someone outside of my circle what I feel I have done wrong. And I think that's where faith should be, full stop. It shouldn't matter where we come from. But I've gone totally off topic, sorry. I was asking about
No,
Druid.
It's really interesting. We'll come back to Druidry and Forest Church and all sorts of things, but
Yeah,
it's really interesting what you're saying about communion. That must be such a hard place to not be able to access something that's so important to you. And I guess if we look at the Quaker practice as a kind of communion, so we
yeah,
might say that it is a form of communion, of communing with
yeah,
God as part of a community, but because it doesn't have physical elements, because it's only the internal part of the
yeah,
process, we can have a completely open table, and
yeah.
we can open that to everyone who walks through the door. And it's a very special gift to be able to offer to the world.
No, I genuinely think that's how it should be. Full stop. You should be able to go anywhere, and whatever their tradition, just be able to slide in. And as long as you respect their tradition, I would, if I came into one of your meetings, I'd be like, oh, right, I need to, I want to be respectful to you. I might not understand what's going on, and I might be like, and then afterwards, I might go, did I do right? Did I, because that's me. But I'm still trying to get to grasp, and it's not in a bad way, it's in a good way. I just like the idea of, even, and from what you've said, this is how I've picked up. If I was to come to a meeting tomorrow and sit there, and we're all there in silence, and I felt that I was being told to communicate something or to pass that message on,
Yeah,
I think I like that idea that I could just speak up and say, and to actually externally say it, rather than, because I've had times at churches I go to, I've gone, I really, really have this what's being said, inside. I'm like, this wants to come out, but you have to bite your tongue,
yeah,
because it's not how we worship. And I just like that idea that, you know, as long as it's the spirit guiding you, that you can say without fear of being ridiculed or told, how dare you? Who
mm,
do you think you are? Sort of attitude
yeah.
to say that.
Mm.
A- And I think that's a really positive thing.
Yeah, well, I'm told that actually the established church in England in the 17th century did have an attitude a bit more like that. So Quakers used to go round to churches, and sometimes they'd be very disruptive and interrupt the sermon and shout back. But sometimes so stories where George Fox goes into a church and he says to the preacher, "Can I speak? You finished your sermon. Can I speak now?" And the preacher gives him permission and says,
Yeah,
"Yes, go ahead." Um, and then sometimes some of the congregation become Quakers. The Quakers get less popular at that point.
yeah,
But but there was this idea that actually other people should be allowed to speak, and that it
mm,
wasn't just coming from the pulpit, as it were,
yeah.
coming from one person. So maybe we could have a bit more of that in churches. If
I,
an Anglican church near me said, "We're going to have an open preaching session, we're going to read this biblical passage," someone will comment on it, and then everyone will throw it open for everyone in the congregation
yeah,
to have a go. I might go to that, because that would
yeah,
be quite an interesting, just a slightly different way of engaging with it.
yeah.
And you would have that space. I've had experiences like that too, particularly with like Buddhist meditation, where the expectation is that everyone is silent. And if you're used to Quaker worship and then you switch over to Buddhist meditation, it can be apparently very similar, but then you're sitting there with something you want to share, and it's definitely not allowed in the meditation.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, those kinds of switching between different norms can be quite a difficult experience.
No, do you know what? I really like the idea. I really do like the idea, and I do think we can learn a lot more by doing that as well, because we don't just get that one viewpoint. You know, we get different people's guidance, words, and different people will phrase it in different ways. Different people use different language, and
Yeah.
I just think that's just something really brilliant. Um, I'm just reading your thing. That's why I keep looking up. I've got it on my big screen so I can see it
Yeah.
as well. Um, you've done a book, I believe.
Several books.
Several. Oh,
Which ones would you like to hear
I
about?
don't know it. I just got that you've done Quaker books, and obviously, you know, tell us about. Oh, right, you've got.
I've got them here.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, so I've got a few books. These two are kind of Quaker theology books. So this was the first one, Telling the Truth About God, which is about how Quakers talk about our experience of the divine, and particularly how we handle having a wide range of different theological views in the community.
Yeah,
And Hearing the Light was the follow up to that. It's an attempt to find out what's the core of Quaker theology. What do we actually all share, even though we have this diversity? And the other one is Quakers do what? Why? Which which is an attempt to give quick answers to all the things you wanted to know about Quakers but didn't dare to ask anybody. So it has lots of chapters that are just really short answers to questions. It starts with wait, Quakers still exist, and goes on through things about Quaker worship, different kinds of Quakerism, how Quakers make decisions, what do Quakers do about baptism and the Eucharist? What about Christmas and Easter? What
yeah,
about weddings and funerals? So yeah, really covers all sorts of things that people might want to know, and they might not know where to go to ask. Or they might kind of know but have trouble explaining. And I think people who are already Quakers sometimes find it useful just to read what someone else said about it to help us clarify our own thoughts.
yeah. Can I just say I like the title of the second one? Hearing, is it Hearing the Light?
It is Hearing the Light, yes.
There's something about that title, Hearing the Light, because when we normally talk about the light, we talk about seeing it. You
Yeah.
know, I talk to people a lot and talk about darkness because I do find I spend a lot of time in the dark, but being able to see the light, and that's from a spiritual and mental health point of view. I do
Mhm.
spend quite a lot of time sat in dark places, but can still see the light. And I think hearing the light, it's just I don't know.
Yeah.
There's something about that title. I don't, and maybe that's why you picked it. But there's just
Yes.
something that says hearing the light, because
Mm.
sometimes you cannot see the light for the darkness. No
Yeah.
matter, you know, there has been time, but you can always hear a good message.
Yeah.
And I think connecting in my head, I'm going message and light, same thing. It's just a
Mm.
different terminal. I really do like that idea of that name for a book.
Yeah. And I didn't invent the phrase, but I really liked it because
Yeah,
of that kind of mixing metaphors, combining senses to say
yeah,
this isn't a physical light, this isn't a physical
yeah,
hearing, but we might hear the light, we might sense the movement of the spirit, we might see something that's not physically there, but we're using a kind of spiritual sense to discern a deeper reality.
yeah. No, I really like that. Um, Briefly, you've mentioned Brookwood quite a few times.
Yeah.
What is Brookwood?
It's called Woodbrook.
Oh, Woodbrook.
And
Sorry, sorry.
that's
Oh,
all right.
that's my
It's,
dyslexic
it's
brain. I don't know why I.
confusing, isn't it? Woodbrook is a Quaker educational charity. So we started out as a college. Actually, George Cadbury gave a building that was called Woodbrook for people to run a college in. So once upon a time, we ran like term time courses, and people came to stay while they were studying. More recently, we've moved. We're letting go of the physical building. We're working online. We're coming to different places. So we run lots of courses, mostly short courses, everything from one evening to maybe 4 or 6 weeks, sometimes a year or more. All kinds of things about Quakerism, introductions to Quakerism, the essentials, how to get started, what happens in Quaker worship, how can you go deeper. If you've been appointed to one of those roles in the Quaker community that we were talking about, what do you do? What's the job actually involved? Where can you find support? How do you deepen your spiritual life? Courses about different spiritualities, different spiritual techniques, courses about theology and history, courses about the different kinds of Quakerism all around the world. So for all your Quaker educational needs, the Woodbrook website is the place to go to find out about all of those things we're doing, learning, research and worship.
No, that sounds really good. I'm just looking and curious and being aware of time, and I want to start winding us down. But do you know what? I hope that you maybe will come back and we could maybe talk about Druidism, because I've probably said that wrong. It's probably not Druidism. It's probably got a proper nice title. But I just, again, there's something that I'm fascinated about, because I don't know a lot about Druidism, but the little bits I do know, for me, it's mainly going back to nature. It's involved with the seasons, the changing, and I just think I'd really love you to come back and maybe talk about that for us, because the idea of Journeys of Faith is to talk about any faith by anybody, because there's no right or wrong with faith for me. I think every time you hear something about someone else's faith, you go, I go away going, that's really good. And actually, I think we need to do that and make that part of our routine. And I do take things away from different people's faiths. And, you know, I really like that. So I'd love you to come back on that.
I'd be delighted to come and talk about Druidry and neo-paganism. And actually, you mentioned that TikTok I did about Quakers and Freemasonry. But a while ago, I did a TikTok about Quakers and Catholicism, where someone was asking me about the similarities and differences there. And I think you and I could have a really interesting conversation picking up on that too.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm happy to have conversations like this anytime with anybody. It's just sometimes it's the person. I was lucky that you was open and receptive to that conversation. Some people aren't open and receptive because they're worried that where's it going, whereas I try to be respectful. If I'm not, I don't mind people saying, actually, that's rude, don't do that, you need to think about the way you said it. I'm happy for people to say that, but I don't think we can have community without dialogue, and I think faith can be one of them hot topics where people don't know how you're going to approach them. They don't know whether you're going to try and scold them and disagree with them and that's one thing I never try and do. I try to be genuine and go, actually, I don't know anything about your faith, teach me. And then you can always find a common ground, you know. And it's, for me, because I'm still exploring, even though I still feel called to become a vicar, I'm still very open to being pushed in a different direction if that's where God feels he's taking me. And that's why I started this. And it's really a shame David couldn't join us today, because David, again, is another Freemason and he comes from a different tradition and does things differently. And to be honest, me and David shouldn't be friends, because we totally have way different viewpoints on our faith. We're very, he believes in Gnostic gospels more than I do. But do you know what? we work really well together because we're open to that open dialogue. So do you want to just leave us with, if anyone wants to ask you any further questions, or the TikTok, I'll put links into the description of your website and your TikTok account anyway, but is there anything else that they might be able to get hold of you if they want to ask you a specific question? Or
Yeah, well, the best ways to get hold of me are probably through my blog or through social media. So I'm on TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, and Mastodon at the moment. So yeah, do get in touch. My work email address is on my profile on the Woodbrook website as well. So that's another way to get hold of me. It's always good to hear from people. And if there's a topic you're interested in exploring, I run courses on some of this stuff. So I've got courses coming up later this year on how Quakers talk about God, for example. You don't have to be a Quaker to come on them. Everybody's welcome to come and find out about Quakers and how Quakers do particular things. So do have a look at the Woodbrook website to see what courses I've got coming up. And yeah, it would be really good to hear from any of your listeners who are interested. And yeah, I hope we can get a date where David can join us for another episode.
yeah. No, definitely we will do that, and I might end up joining you on some of the courses as well. But Rhiannon, sorry, Brett, I'm losing it now. It's gone too late in the day. I've had a long day.
Time to
But
stop.
no, thank you for joining us, Rhiannon, and I really appreciate your time today. And for now, I'm going to say goodbye from me, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Bye for now.